Good. We're live. Nothing's really happening, so it's just like murmurs. This thing is so cool. I love it. I love it so much. Yeah, it's such a smart little device. And if we pull up, that's like a podcast that I was listening to. Look at us.
Oh, we're on TV.
Yay! I just locked it on the screen for the time being, just while folks are giggling. Look at you, you just waved. Oh, that's so funny.
Oh, that took a while.
Yeah, there's a bit of a delay. Yeah. But I'll just keep checking in, and I was gonna ask the clerks team to just like check in for make sure that's still running. Yeah, exactly.
It's 9:15. Be calling this meeting to order. Are we recording?
We are.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Today is, I believe, May the 19th. It is 9:15 a.m. We are convening now at the Anchorage Public Library in the old Alaska room to have a broad and reaching conversation, kind of part two of a conversation we had last fall on housing policy. As the Assembly continues its work to raise up actionable items from its number one priority, which is addressing housing concerns in the municipality. And it's been the number one concern for at least 2 years identified in our work plan. And I would say probably since 2019, when the governor eliminated funding for certain shelter services, it's been a very, very high priority for the Assembly. So it's awesome to have everybody here. We have many more people than we did last November. So that's good. It's growing, and that growth will probably provide some really good new voices and opportunities, and also some challenges to make sure we're continuing to make progress throughout the day. And as we move towards the main part of this process, which will be in the fall. Our conversations focused on action and deliverables. The event is going to be streamed, or is being streamed on YouTube Live. Know that these microphones may pick up anything you say in the room or may not. And so try to keep the microphone off when you're not speaking. There are restrooms in the back of the room. There are exits in the rear and over here behind me in case we need them. To my left, we have some snacks. There's a little bit of a discussion I've been asked to have on decorum. This will be fairly informal as we can be, because the intent is to be having a conversation with stakeholders and members, hearing presentations, and if needed, the decorum will just become more formal if challenges present themselves. But I don't anticipate that being the case today. So I will be running the meeting, but for the most part, we have experts and leaders who are going to be delivering their presentations to us, and then in the afternoon we'll be having a more open conversation. It's like a little bit more jazz-like in its nature. So if you're viewing this on the live stream or listening, a reminder to you is that all materials that we share today will be found online at www.muni.org/assembly, and then click on the button that says housing. And as we begin today, I would like to recognize we are gathered on Dena'ina homelands, and I'm grateful for the past, present, and future stewardship of the Dena'ina people. Now I'll start into a brief recap of what happened in the fall last year in this room. The Assembly, as I mentioned before, has long worked on housing issues, but in 2022, it started to really push its way forward to becoming a priority because housing is just at a crisis level in our town. We gathered at a retreat to focus on what the assembly could do to increase housing affordability and accessibility. We heard from community planners and ministry representatives about problems and potential solutions. We generated a list of priorities now known as the Housing Project Tracker, which you can find in your binders. And as soon as we got back from the retreat, we started tackling projects on the list, including parking minimums and easing building ADUs. And we also established by resolution Assembly's housing priorities. And we've now invested in a year-long effort, it was a years-long effort to focus on housing action. This retreat is the kickoff to that initiative, which will lead up to the community summit this fall, work groups and action steps running throughout the year. Now, I've heard some folks who've been around a long time, man, it seems like we're always having conversations. And is this just one more in a long string of conversations that don't amount to much? And I would argue back to that. You get out of it what you bring to it plus. And I think if you look at the actions of the assembly leading up to today over the last 2 years, you can see a demonstrated commitment to achieve change in housing policy. So we're going to build on that. It's action that we're after. And housing action is one of the top priorities this year. You will see a number of legislative proposals coming forward in the coming months. There's easier to consider triplexes and fourplexes as residential property instead of commercial property. There are conversations about changes to encourage density. You'll hear about more of these ideas that we put on the list today. And steps to carry out more of the projects we prioritized last fall on the housing planning department and our community partners. I don't see Bill Taylor here, but over the course of the last several months, the home builders have put forward kind of a one-pager with about 25 priorities on it, and asking them, challenging them to develop each of those into a one-page project description that gives us some sense of what we need to do. And so he said he would hopefully have that prepared for us today. I hope he does arrive with it, because there, I think, are achievable low-hanging fruit priorities in every direction. As we work to carry out more of the project. So a brief overview of the agenda today. We're just Nolan Clouda, who's from UIA Center for Economic Development, titled The Upside Down of Housing in Anchorage. Nolan also serves on the Budget Advisory Commission, perhaps the chair. We'll have a break at 10:30. At 10:45, Housing Action in Action by Assembly members Cross and Boland with our staff, Allie Hartman. Then at 10:55, Housing Incentive Research by Mike Robbins with Anchorage Community Development Authority. Item 7, we'll have a working lunch called Housing Preference and Demand, starting at 11:05 by Christine Bennell and Daniel McKenna Foster, which will brief us on the May Housing White Paper. Then we'll have Bennell and Daniel McKenna Foster, which will brief us on the May Housing White Paper. Then we'll have a discussion with a panel starting with Ashley Floyd, whom I haven't met, I don't think, from Brick and Birch, Spinelli, Spinell Homes, and Mike Robbins from ACDA. Finally, we'll have a 2 to 2.5 hour discussion called Vision to Action, facilitated conversation with Michael Frederick of we have ample quality housing for all members of our community. What 3 to 5 policy issues must lead the Assembly administration and community address to make this happen? The session will be focused on identifying barriers, strategies to achieve success, and stakeholders and community members committed toward. That's fine. I'm going to ask folks to say who they are.
Anchorage Assembly District 2, Chugai, River, Birchwood, Klutna. Really appreciate this happening. What do I hope will happen is definitive action steps to help us continue the voracious effort we put forth in last year. But specific action steps that we can take forward immediately. Thank you.
Zach Johnson, Anchorage Assembly District 6, South Anchorage, Turnagain, and Girdwood. I would say my goal is close to the line with Kevin's.
Scott Myers, District 2, Chugette, Eagle River, J Bear. I want to echo what Kevin and Ms. Zalatel, Mr. Boland, Mr. Cross have been working on and add anything that I can. I think they're on the right track and it's something that's desperately needed in the city. So thank you.
George Martinez, Anchorage Assembly, District 5, East Anchorage. And my goals for today are understanding, learning to have a better action plan. Thank you.
Hi, Anna Brawley, Assembly representing West Anchorage, and I live in the neighborhood of Spurnigan, a part of Turnagain that people call Spinard. And I would like to, I guess, two things. One is to kind of learn what's happened before, what's already been discussed and where we are. And then I'm looking forward to prioritizing, making some clear priorities and then being able to communicate those priorities to the public.
Good morning, everyone. Felix Rivera, Anchorage Assembly, representing Midtown, the heart of Anchorage. So for me, I one of the biggest outcomes I want from this retreat is to understand how specific action steps translate into a series of strategies and a vision for housing in our community.
My name is Amanda Moser. I live in Airport Heights, and I am excited to be a part of a conversation that is action-focused.
Thank you. Christopher Constant, representing the North District, downtown and east of Turpin, above Chester Creek, including some parts of Spinard. Also the chair of the assembly. And I have a real estate license and referral in the business for some years. I'm strongly supportive of reigniting Anchorage's housing market for a lot of reasons. And that's it. Welcome, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Zalatel. I represent Midtown, the heart of Anchorage with Felix. And what I'd like to get out of the day is bold ideas that can be implemented. I think we're at a turning point on housing policy in Anchorage, and I would like us to think really big and work back from there to things that we can implement now in the medium term and in the long term. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Boland. I represent North Anchorage, District 1, the urban core. I like to say we're number one for a reason. I'm excited to have this conversation because Anchorage needs abundant housing. And the question we need to begin to ask ourselves is, I love my neighborhood. How can I welcome more people to live here and love it too? Thanks.
My name is Karen Bronga. I am District 5. I live in Chugach Foothills. I am interested, hopefully, to find out a little bit about repurposing homes. I think I found recently that there's 170 derelict homes in Anchorage that no one's paying taxes on. I know SB 77 didn't pass, but we are sitting on a wealth of properties that are detracting from East Side neighbors and all over the city, in fact. And I'm hoping that we can work to not only do new build, but do some refurbishing.
Thank you. I'm Randy Solt. I represent District 6, South Anchorage. As long as we're throwing labels out, I'll say it's the gateway to Chugach Park where Anchorage goes to recreate. What I want to get out of today, number one, is I want to listen. I want to listen to the experts and hear what those who deal with this every day have to say and what challenges they face. And then second, like was said earlier, come up with and support the specific actions that are going to move the dial forward, move the ball forward, change the dial. We can talk a lot, we can have committee meetings, we can meet, but unless we actually put action to our words, nothing changes. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Christine Vanelli, Long Range Planning. I'm here to help you understand the white paper that Daniel and I and our team worked on for this meeting today. And I just want to call your attention to page 20 and page 21.
I hope you'll be able to take a look at that and use that as a foundation for the conversations later for the action items that will hopefully you all will consider and potentially adopt. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Daniel McKenna-Foster. I'm a planner in long-range planning. Also just here, thanks for having us. We're glad to support, help provide information, answer any questions. So thanks again.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Robbins, the Executive Director for the Anchorage Community Development Authority. And my goal for today is to spend a lot of time listening to the experts and to help everyone understand what a tool the Community Development Authority can be helping us solve this problem.
Hi, Nolan Clouda. I direct the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development. I'm here to share some information that I have about housing market in Anchorage and some of the big picture trends and contribute to the conversation, however, is helpful. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Good morning. It's good to be back. My name is Tyler Robinson. I'm the Vice President of Community Development and Real Estate at Cook Inlet Housing Authority. I live in East Anchorage in the UMed district. I work in Spinar. I think we have housing in every one of your assembly districts. My hope for today, among some very specific actions, is that we start understanding that we don't have one housing sort of crisis, if you want to call it that. We have multiple housing issues, and the strategies that it takes are not the same for each of those. I think it's important to understand who we're trying to serve and how in each of those instances. Thanks.
Thank you. So there are a number of people in the audience, actually a pretty full room, members of the administration, members of UAA and ICER, former members of the Assembly. Mr. Weddleton, welcome. We have representatives of ACDA, AEC, and also private building interests in the room. And so with that, we are so we don't have, so yeah, it's a little bit tricky. We're going to ask folks who are in the audience to come up one at a time, single file, use that microphone and do the same thing. Tell us who you are, why you're here, and what part of town you're from, and what you hope to get out of today, because we have a little bit of time before we get to the notice next section. So start with the front. The microphone is right in front of Mr. Cross.
Craig, I'm Planning Director. I'm here to listen, here to work collaboratively.
Craig Street, not to be confused with Craig Lyon. I'm a private community development consultant. I live in East Anchorage, and I'm here to learn. Thanks.
Art Clark, I'm the broker at New Realty Group and Alaska Real Estate Associates. We do property management and sales. I'm a past president for the Anchorage Board of Realtors. I've been involved in housing issues for a long time and hope to help wherever I can.
Good morning, my name is Carolyn Hall. I live in Turnagain, and I'm an interested community member who's involved in housing and homelessness. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Tony J. Andrew. I'm a community member. Thank you.
My name is Jed Relay. I'm Community Systems Program Manager at the Anchorage Health Department. I live in Muldoon, and I am happy to be here to help contribute to this conversation.
Alexis Johnson, Anchorage Health Department. I'm the Housing and Homeless Coordinator for the Municipality of Anchorage. I'm hoping to find new creative ways to bring housing online, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks so much.
John Weddleton, Bike to Work Day Station Collector, and I'm on the board of the Anchorage Affordable Housing Land Trust and former assembly.
I'm Eric Klatt. I'm a renter in District 1. I'm a public interest attorney who's worked on homelessness and issues related to affordable housing. I'm here just to deepen my understanding of what's happening in the community to address those issues.
I'm Jim Weingarner, Project Acquisition Director for ACDA, here to help.
Monica Gross, I'm with RRS. I'm a physician. I really believe housing is health.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shanna Zespan with AgriVet Consulting, also here to be a resource and help.
Good morning, everybody. Lance Wilbur. I'm the Executive Director of Community Development. I live in West Anchorage, and I'm here to figure out how I can make your policies get implemented here over time, primarily through the Permit Center, from Planning, Development Services, Public Works.
Good morning, Bill Pop, President and CEO of the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, proud East Sider, and this is my, I think, 18th version of housing discussions since the Sullivan administration, and looking forward to progress on this one.
My name is Clay Porter. I'm an architect and a general contractor, and I've been building in the city since 1972. And I also represent the Anchorage Home Builders Association. And what I'd like to see is, I'd like to see us build more housing. We're just not doing it. I came for the answers. Thank you.
Brett Watson, I'm an assistant professor at ICER and UAA. I live off of Muldoon. I'll also introduce my ICER and UAA econ colleagues, Kevin Perry, associate professor in economics, and my colleague Mary Caputo for ICER. Kevin lives in Turnagain and Mary lives off of Diamond. Thanks.
Melinda Gant, Anchorage Community Development Authority, External Affairs Director, and I look forward to this collaborative event. ACDA has done 2 housing projects, one completed in the Government Hill, North Point Bluff. We've got one downtown that's set to go live August, and I'm looking forward to doing many more.
Good morning, Jason Bockenstead. I'm the Executive Director of the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust, and I'm just looking forward to learning today.
Hi, Jennifer Benaclausen, Legislative and Policy Analyst for the Assembly, here to learn from the community and see how I can support the Assembly in its policy work. Claire Ross, Legislative Services Director, and I help the Assembly develop and carry out their long-term strategic plan. So my role is that we keep that moving along, and I live by service hat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allie Hartman. I am the Communications Coordinator for the Anchorage Assembly. I'm running some of the tech here today, so I'm happy to be here in the space and trying some new things out. I'm really looking forward to hearing what kind of messaging themes, policy ideas come out of this conversation to incorporate into the Assembly's communication goals. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Cross, would you turn that microphone off? Kevin? Thanks. Mr. President arrived just now, so we'll go ahead and let him introduce himself as well. The questions were, who you are, that you're representing, what part of town you live in, work in, and what do you hope to get out of today?
Thank you. I'm Cameron Perez-Rodilla, representing the west side of Anchorage. Really looking forward to the conversation today. I think like many, understanding, where we've come from, where we are, and strategies about how we build more housing and develop more in Anchorage. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, everybody. And so for the record, that's everybody I think is in the room, and it's quite a storied group. And as Mr. Pop suggested, these conversations have been going on for the better part of 20 years. But I would argue, again, have a little bias, that the action agenda of this Assembly for the last couple of years has been at a remarkably different clip. With that said, we're going to move forward, speaking of moving the clip, to our 10 a.m. presentation slightly early, about 20 minutes. And so if we finish early, our next break will be a bit longer. This is a presentation by Nolan Clauda, who's again from the UAA Center for Economic Development. It's called The Upside Down of Housing in Anchorage. As I mentioned before, Nolan also serves on the municipality's Budget and Budget Advisory Commission as chair. And we're grateful to have you here. And go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, Nolan Cloud, I direct the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development, and I wanted to give a bit of an overview, some high-level trends in housing in Anchorage, how it fits into context, how to compare to other places, and give us a little bit of a sense for the challenge that we have with housing in Anchorage. I have a few slides about some big picture, directions for change as well that can be made. So first up, in terms of what's been happening recently, I think come to a head because of some of the strange things that happened during the pandemic and as a result of those circumstances where housing really exploded nationally in terms of price. Everybody was there were low interest rates, there were high rate of household savings. There were some age-related demographic factors as well that caused a lot of people to be looking for housing in a relatively short time that really pushed up prices. We saw that locally here in Anchorage. We saw that statewide. We saw that nationally. It was not something that was terribly unique to us, but I think that underneath the surface of that, Anchorage does have its own particular flavor of a housing problem. Can I go 2 slides forward, actually? So yeah, so here's what we see here at the national level. The blue line is Anchorage, the red line is the United States. It's actually the Anchorage MSA, which includes both Anchorage and the Mat-Su Valley. This is the median listing price for a home, comparing it over the last few years. And you can see that it really spiked, during, and especially the time period right after 2020, during 2020, 2021. Is when that happened. And we are now at a point where, as of April 2023, the median home price in Anchorage is about $445,000. You're going to see there are different estimates of this, by the way, from different sources, but this is the listing price from the national data that's comparable. Above the national price, there have been some times where it goes back and forth a little bit, where the U.S. price has been a little bit higher, but clearly prices have gone up in kind of concert. Our trends are not super unique in that regard. Prices are probably coming down a little bit. The interest rates are higher. They've gone way up. Cost of a mortgage is much higher than it was, in 2020 and 2021. But we still have a long ways to go to get down to where we were pre-pandemic. And it's not necessarily super clear that we're getting that way very fast. Next slide, please. So here's a way of comparing houses and other types of goods nationally that are more apples to apples. So the cost of living index, which Mr. Pop knows all about, that ADC collects for Anchorage, but there's 300 metros in the United States that are part of this data collection effort that looks at prices to compare cost of living, housing being one component of that. And so, when we're talking about like the average home price in one place versus another place, are we talking about, we're not necessarily describing the exact same house because it might be a newer house in one place, might be a bigger house in one place. We don't account for all of those things, but this house is the idea is that it's the same house compared across all the metros in the United States. So for 2022, this house is 2,400 square feet on an 8,000 foot lot, has 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and it's new construction. That house costs $625,000 in Anchorage. You can see the other cities in Alaska here. Fairbanks, that same house is about $459,000. The U.S. median across all the metros is under $400,000. It's $369,000 from this data set. So you can see when we actually compare apples to apples, that there's actually a bigger problem with affordability than we think. We're getting probably less of a house for the money here in Anchorage, Alaska, is what it seems. Than you would expect nationally, even compared to a couple of other places in state, although not quite as bad as Juneau. We're usually really close with Juneau in this regard. Now, one thing is that this house is probably, in Anchorage, a house of this size is probably more of a custom build. So that's something that would elevate the price over something that was spec built. We don't see a lot of as much spec building of homes, but it's still pretty clear that like for like, it costs a lot more for a house in Anchorage.
Nolan, just one quick second. If folks want to shift chairs, there's also a screen over here. I'm not sure if you can see it behind the pillar, but you guys can just, because we're going to have a number of presentations today, so the chairs move. You guys don't have to stand. You can certainly move around. Thanks.
Next, please. So here's a price comparison across the state. And I'm sorry if it's a little small to read, but this is the average home price across different parts of Alaska. With the Anchorage price for 2022 being about $469,000. That's just the average price, an average house, whatever the characteristics of it. Juneau and Anchorage are the most expensive. We're about 10% over the statewide average, which is already we're an expensive state. about the same. Matsu Valley is right around the state average, so we're about 10% more expensive than the Matsu Valley. There, again, we don't know if this is exactly the same characteristics of the house, but the Matsu Valley one is likely to be newer construction as well. The cheapest places to build housing in Alaska generally are the cheapest homes that we observe as far as the prices go, usually going to be on the road system away from Anchorage, right? So that's where the Kenai Peninsula, Fairbanks, North Scarborough, Matsu Valley, other places in between generally are going to have the lowest cost. They have the access to the highway transportation system and the Port of Anchorage. Port of Alaska, and at the same time, more land availability and generally little or no land use regulation. Next, please. So this is I think pretty stark to look at. On the left you see the spike going up. That's average price of a home in Anchorage, the average listing price, and then on the right that's the count of inventory that's on the market. It follows this cyclical path because there's always more in the summer than in the winter on the market. And this is just looking at the last couple of years. This only goes back to I think 2017 is when it starts. So the time period you're looking at, we bought our house in 2019, which is actually right about near the peak of there being the most inventory on the market. And we complained, my wife and I complained so hard about how little there was available to look at. In Anchorage, and the type of house that we're looking for, the type of neighborhoods we're looking for. We had our list of, we want all of these criteria in our house, and then we threw that list out the window and put in an offer on the first place that didn't repulse us. But I kid, we have a great place. But you see that inventory from that point is much lower than it was just a couple of years ago. It's right pre-pandemic I'm talking about. So very little on the market. So we're getting squeezed on both sides where there's more demand for homes and yet less on the market. So it's something that we really feel, I think. Next, please. So this question comes up all the time, and I think that some folks who have been kind of following housing issues probably know some of this answer, but why does housing demand high in Anchorage? Because we're famously have been suffering from outmigration. We've had a solid decade plus of more people leaving the city than coming to it. Our population has shrunk a bit. So shouldn't demand for housing fall? Well, the answer to that is that we actually, the changing demographics, especially with regard to age, we have fewer people than we had in 2010, right? So Anchorage has a couple thousand people fewer than in 2010, and I looked at 2021 data from Census Bureau as the most recent. But we actually have more households than we used to, and we have more adults than we used to. The population of adults, people over 18 in Anchorage, is higher than it was in 2018. So we've mostly lost at the young end, at the children. There are fewer children, fewer families with children. Families with children have more people per household. If I have two kids, my wife and I have two kids, we have a household of 4 in 20 years. If both kids moved out, if they ever move out, who knows? They're less than 2 and 4. We'll give them time. But they could, in theory, in 20 years, we could be 3 households, the same 4 of us, right? And that's what you've seen kind of happening, that type of dynamic. You can see the graph that I have there. This is household size, 1, 2, 3, or 4 plus people per household. You can see that the blue is 2020. The one-person households are really what spiked there, right? We have a lot of one-person households, more than we used to. But people stretching fuels more demand for housing. Renowned economist UAA Brett Watson actually came up with a brilliant idea for addressing this. He suggested some kind of way that the assembly could incentivize senior dating. So maybe some of those one-person households could be consolidated. This might alleviate some of the shortage. We give him credit for that idea. Next, please. So in terms of, now talk about the construction, the building of homes, and this is really where we know we have some problems, right? So this is looking at all the states in the country. I looked at how many new units are permitted for every 1,000 residents, and probably a bit hard to read. The typical, for every 1,000 residents nationwide, you have about 5 units of housing getting built. So every 1,000 people, about 5 units getting built. In the state of Alaska as a whole, we build about 2 units. California, famously a terrible state at building enough housing, they build 3. So we're ranking 45th as a state overall for that measure. We build very little housing. Alaska has some somewhat fairly well-known challenges with housing. The fact is that construction is more expensive. That's probably the number one issue. But there are probably other factors that are lurking within that as well. Next slide, please. So zeroing in even more on Anchorage and looking at Anchorage itself, this is actually new housing units added. It's a little bit of a different measure than permits, but from a different source, but roughly comparable. So Anchorage itself, just the city of Anchorage, builds about 1.3 units of housing per 1,000 people. So 1.3, compare that to 5 for the country as a whole, right? Or even a little bit over 2 for the state as a whole. 1.3 units of housing per 1,000 people is really minuscule. So I threw out some numbers, and I don't, I'm not saying that I have a magic number of how many units of housing we need to add. I don't have that formula for you, but we build for the last couple of years somewhere in the ballpark of 380 houses or 80 units of housing in the city. So about 380 units in the city. So if we were to match the statewide average, we would have to build about 700 units. And that statewide average is not really that impressive of a number. I mean, if we were to build at the national average level, it would be 1,500 units of housing per year. So we're talking, more than a threefold increase. And if we were to match the Mat-Su, it would be 2,000 units a year, which I'm not saying that, we could probably remove every barrier on housing and probably not get the 2,000 units of the Mat-Su. I mean, there's other factors to look at there. But I think that this is probably a good metric to be thinking about is how many units are we adding per year, and where does that rank and compare to other places? I think is probably something really critical. The Mat-Su Valley builds about 7 units per 1,000 people, right? So above the national average, and it's by far and away the biggest builder of homes in the state. 40% of all the housing units that are built in Alaska are built in the Mat-Su Valley, and they only have about 14% of the population. So that's there's definitely a bit of a disparity there. Next, please. Now, why is it so different in the Mat-Su? And I don't want to suggest that I'm a guy who's born in Anchorage, and I've never been like, wow, we should be more like the Mat-Su Valley. Nothing against friends from that area, but I think that what's different about it? Well, I mean, the biggest thing, so we share an economic base with the Mat-Su Valley. You can't say the Mat-Su Valley is a great economy and Anchorage has a suffering economy, because we are one economy. The greatest part of the Mat-Su population, the workforce of the Mat-Su is tied to Anchorage. So we share one economic base. So it's not necessarily obvious that there's some kind of disparity as far as employment growth or something like that. Land availability in the Mat-Su Valley is incomparable to Anchorage, right? I mean, we have built out to a much greater extent, so that's the biggest single factor, most likely. But I think that there is a role in there for zoning, permitting, for land use regulations, and for factors like that. I think in a lot of the Mat-Su Valley, there's little or none of those things. Do we want to go to that extreme? Probably not. But I think that probably is a factor in the disparity that we're talking about. Next, please. So talking a little bit about multifamily. So Anchorage is an expensive place for rent as well. The average rent from the Department of Labor for 2022 for an apartment rent, and it's more for renting a house, but an apartment is about $1,350. Anchorage we have a vacancy rate of about 3.2%, very low vacancy rate, by the way. National average is around double that. Typically, and the country as a whole right now is at a pretty low point, multi-year low point for its vacancy rate, and that 6% is around double what Anchorage's vacancy rate is. Anchorage is usually in about the top 20% of metros in the United States as far as rent costs go. Very little family construction has been built in Anchorage in decades. I think Tyler Robinson is going to have a lot to say about that he can add a lot more detail to. But we're clearly not building much multifamily, housing in Anchorage right now, and that does seem to be a big part of our affordability issue, especially for younger people that are lower income. A lot of people are more likely to be renters. Next, please. So talking about short-term rentals, they're the sort of boogeyman for a lot of these conversations. I'm a little bit cautious about putting too much blame on short-term rentals. I think there's probably a lot that we should learn about before saying that they're the big culprit. So we do know that, nationally, there is plenty of research that says that short-term rentals, like Airbnb and VRBO, or I guess they call themselves Vrbo now or whatever, they probably do contribute to rent increases in certain areas. They probably do contribute to elevated cost of housing in some places, right? But to what extent, we don't necessarily know. So, but for some perspective, there are about 1,800 housing units in Anchorage that are short-term rentals. Well, how much is that in the scale of things? It's around it's equal to around 4% of our total rental housing units, and about 1.5%, 1.5% of our total housing units. So 4% of rental housing, 1.5%. That doesn't necessarily seem like a lot, maybe, but when you consider that the difference between like our vacancy rate of 3.2 and the national rate of around 6, if you're talking about a few percentage points availability on either side in rental housing, that does potentially make a difference. Now, not all 1,800 of those units, if Airbnb went away tomorrow, would suddenly become available for long-term rentals. It's not necessarily the case, but some share of them would. So we don't have a definitive answer about how much this is contributing, but it probably is a factor in rental costs. It probably is factoring in some way. If we're looking at a place like Girdwood, it's kind of bonkers. 37% of the equivalent of 37% of the rental units in Girdwood are short-term rentals, right? I mean, there are certain smaller communities in Alaska where it probably makes a really big difference. Seward, Talkeetna, places like that that have a big kind of seasonal type of influx, big visitor destination for their size. Anchorage, we'd be talking about a smaller impact overall. That's maybe significant, but certainly a smaller piece of the puzzle. So I'm cautious about putting too much blame on it, but it is something that warrants some investigation. Next, please. So zoning and code reforms, I think probably something that's going to come up quite a bit today. But the point that I want to emphasize here is that I don't have all the answers on how much our Title 21 contributes to our problems. I really can't simply tell you that, but I think that it's really worth understanding that every requirement, every piece of regulation, every zoning ordinance does add some cost. It does add some cost for the developer. And when we're talking about a place where it's hard to build housing profitably, multifamily or single family, it's hard to build it profitably to make it worth the time of the developer to actually do it. So we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about whether the regulations that we have are actually worth the cost that they're bringing. So we're talking about things like minimum lot sizes. What value does that have to us? I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't have value, but what is that value, and is it worth the cost? The various kinds of external aesthetic types of requirements or setbacks or landscaping requirements or various other things that limit density or the different types of residential zoning that restrict what you can build. I think that these are things to look at in a really hard-nosed way. What are these doing? Are these increasing the welfare of the community, or are they not? And I have more questions than answers, but I think that these are things to look at in a really critical way. Next, please. So one idea that's been floated quite a bit nationally, bit hard to read here, but the idea of by right development. In other words, development that has plenty of requirements that you have to meet, but that if you meet them, you simply are approved without there being a discretionary element. So bypassing a certain amount of process in order to approve developments more rapidly, more predictably, I guess, and probably at lower cost or less time delay to the developer. I think that this type of thing also is something that's being talked about a lot at the national level. A lot of these conversations around zoning and permitting reform are happening nationally. There's a big movement that's doing this. I mean, many of you are probably aware of. This is certainly one of the ideas coming out of that. Next, please. And I believe this is my last slide, but I think Shauna Zuspan is here, and Shauna has had some really excellent insights about what can be done with regard to things like tax abatement for multifamily construction. I know that we have some of that in Anchorage, I think, for downtown, but how that could be expanded, how you can actually, for a number of years, remove the property taxes on a new multifamily property in order to encourage its development, right? Relatively simple, straightforward idea. This is also Fairbanks and Juneau have also been enacting this as well. That's something that might help move the needle on getting a more positive ROI for multifamily construction. Something that I think is also worth looking at expanding. Also, new sources of capital for real estate loans. Like a lot of times, a commercial lender doesn't want to have a very long repayment term on a multifamily property. You know, something like 7 or 10 years I've seen before for a repayment for a loan. Well, we have entities like ADA, like the Alaska Industrial Development Authority, for a lot of kinds of commercial for a property to become profitable. But that type of financing isn't available for multifamily construction currently. So something like that, some kind of patient capital source like that helps make that more viable is something that's worthwhile. Also, what kinds of funds could be available to finance site infrastructure, the roads, the water, wastewater utilities. We put a lot of that on the shoulders of developers. A lot of places in the rest of the country actually local governments will front a lot of that or help finance a lot of that type of work to be done. We put it all on the developer. There's a cost causer, cost payer type of philosophy there, a few other factors. But again, if you're causing the town equity, you're not giving away that money. You're investing that money to build that site infrastructure. I think that that's also something that is worth looking at with a pretty critical eye. And that, I believe, is my last slide. But I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Cloud. I do have a couple of people in the queue right now, including myself. I'll start with Ms. Browley.
Yeah, thanks
for your presentation, Mr. Cloud. I do have a couple of people in the queue right now, including myself. I'll start with Ms. Browley.
Yeah, thanks, Nolan. This is really good data and things to think about as we're moving forward today. I have two, I guess, questions or observations around, but I don't have data for that.
Yes, the share house of housing that is owner occupied in Anchorage and how that's shifted. I don't know offhand. I really don't know. Typical number in the U.S. is around 7 people living in owner occupied housing, and I think that I don't know how much we deviate from that national average, but a majority of people in Anchorage are certainly living in owner occupied housing.
Yeah, thanks. And then also, this is just anecdotal, but something to think about studying short-term rentals is it seems like there's a phenomenon where people basically rent long-term until May, which is basically not a year-round rental at that point. And so that's another thing just to think about is there a specific summer crunch that basically displaces people from year-round housing? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yes, thank you. Good question there. When I looked at the short-term rental data, comparing it to the number of housing units, we looked at the seasonal high point for housing. You do see that short-term rentals definitely peak in the summer, and there are fewer in the winter. Not too surprising there. Well, we did look at peak. The peak number is what we use. And where it says, yeah, by the way, in May, you're getting out because I can make way more money renting to visitors. I have seen that phenomenon, so it is out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Alto.
Thank you. On the permitted units and the units we're bringing online, that wouldn't account for hotel conversions as we convert those into, unless they pull building permits, right?
I actually, let me see. I don't know if those get counted the same. I don't know. There might be someone from planning may know the answer to that. I don't know how many. I don't know. I'm not sure if I know the answer.
The follow-up question to that is whether or not we would capture units, if we're looking at the permitted units, if we bring former units back into a habitation standard. So if we had something that was an abandoned property and we brought it back online, would that count as permitted units? Because if that's one of the factors, or if that's kind of a development or growth factor looking at, and we're finding new ways to create housing units, how do we make sure we capture them? It's more of a question to make sure we are capturing them. I don't expect you to have the answer to that, but we are trying to find new ways to bring on housing units.
Right. It's a good question. I don't know exactly. I think that the sources that I look at are drawn from permits and kind of surveys of permits. So I don't know specifically if you rehabilitate a unit, whether that counts. It probably depends how it interacts with the permitting process. There are also, at any might be moving a unit from a vacant unit to an inhabited unit. And I don't know how that would affect the data that I'm looking at. I think these things we're talking about are probably relatively small at the margins, but they might still be, important to look at.
Well, the hotel conversions are hundreds of housing units right now. And actually, since Tyler's sitting next to you, do you know, like when you rehab the property out in Mountain View, did those then go into the permitted units that year? The multifamily property?
Yeah, and I saw Chris's reaction. I think Nolan's numbers are new construction, so I don't believe those would show up under new construction. And so I don't think they're counted in the same way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. I have myself in the queue next, but first I want to recognize that we've been joined by Andre Spinelli of Spinell Homes, Jenna Wright with ACDA, Bill Taylor with the Home Builders and Colony Builders, somebody who snuck by without introducing herself the first time, who was here, Brandy Pennington Real Estate, Kyle Smith with the Klutna, and I believe Jeanette Lee with Sightline Institute have all joined us in the room now. My question to you, Nolan, is what's your source for data on the short-term rentals? How did you come up with those numbers?
Yeah, for short-term rentals, there is a private proprietary source called AirDNA, and it's subscription-based and it's kind of market intel for the industry, but it does provide some data available for free, and so we drew the free data that looked total number. It's whole housing units. So not like when somebody Airbnbs a room in their house, it doesn't count. We didn't look at that. We looked at whole housing units that are available at peaks, available at peak time of the year.
Thank you. Next in the queue, I have Ms. Bonga.
So when you were on the page that, I think you were talking about different use codes and it was colored in different, I wanted to know, was that part public lands that couldn't be developed and part that was restricted to single family? I didn't know what the picture was about. Everything was colored differently.
Oh yeah, the picture the picture was really just like a patchwork of zoning in a section of Anchorage, but it was just an illustration was the purpose there. But if you look at a zoning map of Anchorage, it's kind of a cutout of that. But it does show you, the different classes of residential zoning, commercial zoning, and so on that divide up the city.
Okay, thanks.
Next, I have Mr. Bond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was actually going to ask the same question that Chris asked in terms of how recent the short-term rental data is, but it sounds like that was pretty recent.
It was the most recent available so I think it would reflect the summer of 2022 data because that was the most recent peak. We haven't had our peak in 2023 yet.
Okay, thanks. And I'll just say, I think it's pretty sobering, this slide of the comparison between the development that's happening in other parts of Alaska versus Anchorage. And, it makes me ask the question, what are the barriers to development here that are driving developers elsewhere, even in our own state? Thanks.
Right. I mean, I think it's a very complicated question. I think folks from the developer community can probably answer that, in better detail at this point. I think we need to know. I think we need to know a lot more about what the true impact and cost of our requirements are compared to other places. I do think that's a big gap in our understanding, but I think that in more detail, I think the developers are in a better position to tell us that.
All right, thank you. Next in the queue, I have Mr. President.
Thank you. I'm looking at trying to understand the data so that we can use it to try to make decisions. And so I'm just trying to sort of think about it from, do you use levels of cost of housing so that when we're having conversations about, for instance, what affordable housing is, that there would be sort of natural sort of levels in the different costs? And I ask that because I'm also curious about the stock of housing within those levels, so that we would have a sense of, where we are with those different pieces. And then the third part I'm thinking is this idea of moving among those levels. For instance, if you built more here, does that create space and folks move up? And so that if you're building more expensive housing, naturally you would see more affordable housing becoming available because of that movement. I'm curious whether that information is available about levels, where we are at those levels, and movement among those levels.
Yes, thank you. It's a really excellent question. As for the tiers of affordability in terms of housing, I wish that we had better, more granular data about that. I would like to know that because a lot of times we're looking at data where we're thinking in terms of medians or averages, but that doesn't tell us about how many units are available at various different price points. So I don't have a great source of information about that. There might be some kind of rough data in the Census Bureau's ACS data, but not tremendously helpful, and not as helpful as I'd like. I'd like to see some more of that. To your second question, though, about adding more supply of housing and how that impacts the other levels, there is a housing, and there is a process of that they call filtering, where the affordable houses of today were often the more expensive houses of a decade or a couple decades ago. So adding more supply of housing, at any level is generally a good thing. I mean, it might be less helpful at the most extreme, and the most expensive homes, maybe. But generally speaking, a lot of what we call starter homes today, like in Anchorage, that might be. I used to live in New Napa Valley, for instance, at a 720 square foot home. It was built in 1954. It wasn't built as a starter home. It was built as a home. Right? It was built as a middle class home, but it became a starter home, right? So that's really common, and that's really how a lot of housing dynamics work. Is that the new housing of yesterday becomes the affordable housing of today, and so you obviously need supply being added for that to function properly.
Yeah, thanks. There's a couple more real quick ones. So the other piece I'm curious about is length of time in home. Is how long people are in their homes, knowing that we have so many people who are coming and going. I think that might be an interesting piece of data to have in order to think about making some of the decisions that we make. And then the other piece, just breaking down these costs we're talking about, the cost of construction, the cost of permitting on building, and understanding of those a little more granularly. What are those specific barriers, and are there particular material costs or construction costs that are disproportionate to others? And so we don't need to do that today, but I'm curious about that again, to think about what kinds of decisions we can make if there are permitting or changing, or there are one or two of those regulations that are really creating a barrier for folks. And then in terms of just the overall cost of it, where are those at? So that's something at some point, if we could get more granular stuff on that, I think it might be helpful. Thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next, thank you, Mr. Crossen.
Thank you, Nolan. Excellent presentation. The biggest takeaway from here is something I think we all instinctively knew, but it shows up in the presentation, is that although our population has receded slightly, we need more households because we're not having families with 3 and 5 kids anymore. The children that are growing up, or there's fewer here, they're more adults and they're smaller families. But our land use code was specifically designed, however many decades ago, for large family houses. That was specifically in my district, which is very restrictive on density. It's almost written into their land use, which was they wanted urban sprawl. The problem is that our demographics have changed the last decades, and that's not the reality of our need. And so our codes, our applications have been adversarial towards density, been adversarial towards smaller houses, and requiring conditional use. And so some of these things that should be conditional are now the norm. And so I look forward to coming up with some ways that we can adjust that to allow for smaller lot sizes, allow that a PUD rather than a conditional use permit just goes straight to building. My question is that on top of all these restrictions that we've done, if we're going to peel apart and make it easier for smaller development and affordable housing, is there a way to quantify? Now you did speak to this slightly, but is there a quantify as far as how much our bureaucracy adds to the cost of housing? And what I mean by that is the offsite improvement requirement, the open space requirement, all these additional things, or just plan review, treating 3 triplexes, 4plexes, everything is commercial, and all the additional reviews that it goes through. And when you look at that exhaustive process to where it might take a builder a year to a year and a half to get a project even approved, meanwhile they're spending maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars before they even get a yes from our municipality that they can do it. Do we have any idea is there a quantify on what we're adding on to the average household? Thank you.
And I think it's a tremendously important question. What are we at it? What are we, how much are we making the house more expensive or the development more difficult to happen? Can we put dollar value to that? And I don't know of precise figures where someone's done that work. I think it is really important for us to try to do it though. I think it does need to be done. I think we do probably need to know what kinds of costs we're adding. You mentioned also the time delay factor, which would, how long are we delaying a process of building or lengthening the life cycle of development? And that's sometimes not put into dollar terms, but it in fact reduces the ROI of the developer, right? It's increasing the length of time before they can realize any type of return, which does make the development less profitable and less likely to happen, right? So I think that we really do need to know some of those things that you're asking. We have some senses for it, and when you talk to developers, they can tell you that about projects that are delayed or costs that were added. So we have a lot of these kinds of anecdotes out there, and I think that there's really something to it. But I don't know how to put a more precise figure to it. So it's something that I wish I did.
If I may follow up. Yeah, and I agree. We hear the developers say that. The difficulty is, depending on who you ask, they say there's not a problem. But obviously, then there's a disagreement between the bureaucracy that establishes it and the builders who are saying this is an issue. And I guess the only way to say who's correct in what the process is look at our housing and has it improved or has it gotten worse? Thank you.
I would add to that. I mean that there are kind of more analytical ways to look at it too, and rather than the who's right kind of approach. I think we can't. The type of questions we're asking are answerable, but I think that the work of the analysis to do it, I don't think has been done that I have ever encountered. But I'm hesitant to say that it's that we can blame a particular group of municipal staff and say it's their fault. Because some of these things, a lot of things I'm talking about here are policy level decisions that municipal staff are simply implementing too. So I'm hesitant to put blame per se. But I think that all of these things, I think we do need to know the answers to the questions that you're asking.
Thank you. Next, thank you, Mr. Martinez.
Thank you. So just to follow up along that same line of questioning that Member Cross just presented, let me go back to the slide that you highlighted. One of the, we had 3 bullets, and the 3rd bullet was about public investments into infrastructure and other things. But let's just stay into that vein for a second and turn the question potentially on its head. Processes similar, like environmental impact statements and universal reviews, things that may be different than infrastructure, but that are part of the overall cost of doing business and development. You mentioned, and I'm interested in understanding the cost to the public to be able to do universal reviews or a zone of development, whether it's infrastructure, one of those buckets, so that we may be able to start to understand the public investment that we may need to have. And that really raises the cultural question of the user pay model. And I just wanted to flag, because if policymakers in the city is determining a direction with the vision to fulfill a need, I think having the cost to the public from that vantage point would be helpful to have a better sense. And then what is the cost of those things currently? How do they, back to Mr. Cross's point, how do they add on to the cost of doing business in the city as well? So that both sides of those questions, I think, are important for us to be able to get at a cultural understanding of the shifts that we're talking about in policy, that I think the city grew up with a vision that we had inherited, and we're talking about a potential new vision fundamentally in some corridors. But that public investment, I think, is important for us to hear about. And you may not have the answer today, but I wanted to flag that. And then also the cost of those things that not do, how do they contribute to the cost, like Mr. Cross mentioned? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. The site infrastructure cost, could be, a huge variable, right? Because it could be something. It depends on how far away you are. It could be something that's punishingly expensive, or something where it's maybe not so bad if the connections you need to build are already fairly close. But it can be quite expensive, especially when the developer has to shoulder upgrades for the public part of the infrastructure from deteriorated infrastructure, stealing Tyler's thunder. So it can be quite expensive. I think you're getting at a really important point that there could be, there are mechanisms, that are out there, there are ideas, there are models for ways that you can fund that type of infrastructure and recoup those expenses from the increased value that you're adding to the property tax base. And there are probably like legal issues to be worked out that I'm not an expert in, a lot of aspects to it there, but there is an ROI there, I think. You could think about it as an ROI where an investment of public money produces more value by increasing the tax base. And also it's worth mentioning that ADA, Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority, was working on a model to do this up in North Pole by Fairbanks because of military housing expansion, where they were going to receive title to land. ADA was actually going to be the one to finance, to plat the land and build the site infrastructure, and then sell those turnkey lots to developers, to build. So that would be a way. So they would actually finance that, make it much easier for the developer to do that part. The city and borough of Juneau, I understand, did this for some housing units a few years ago as well. Maybe it's been done in Anchorage, I don't even know, but it can be done. I think there's a way to work out the mechanisms to make that possible.
And just to close, thank you for mentioning the ROI and that public investment and that return. I just think that's part of the formula we need to better understand and see, and to highlight that there have been cities who utilized concept that I am not an expert, so I'm using a layman term that sounds good to me. Universal reviews, right? So to be able to really develop a corridor where we talk about planning and particular zones of the opportunities that we see on maps. And we saw a map yesterday from ACDA about where they're targeting some of their investments and their strategies. Just thinking of those core packages and what would potentially look like from a public perspective, a little different than maybe the specificity of the infrastructure, but impact statements, some of the other mechanisms that may go into a broad range of review. And some other cities like Yonkers have done that very successfully in revitalizing their downtowns with housing. Thank you.
Okay, we have approximately 8 minutes left for this conversation. I have Ms. Brawley in the queue.
Yeah, thanks. I just had a follow-up on the discussion. I think it was Cameron who brought it up around looking at different tiers of housing or thinking about different life stages, kind of different. And Tyler, you brought this up too, that there's different segments in the market. I wonder if you could comment on the idea of housing lock, or if you've looked at that. So basically the idea that when there's limited inventory or there's limited affordable inventory for people, even a professional or a family. And I might pick up my friend Kevin over there because I know he's talked about, having another kid, how do you move up into a house and how do you amass the means to do that given our prices? Anyway, the idea that basically if no one can move up or down, or there's no incentive for them to move up or down, that we're inefficiently housing people because they're underpaying for what they could, or, that kind of, that's my understanding of housing lock. And I wondered if you've looked at that at all.
I haven't looked at it specifically, but I think that given how little inventory is on the market, I think that there are some very strong limitations to the kind of mobility that you're talking about. I think that also that type of situation that we might be in is I'm not going to blame all of our out-migration on housing, but I will say that housing availability and affordability is absolutely a determinant of in-migration or out-migration. It is both a symptom and a cause of out-migration in many respects. Thank you.
And not even to talk about interest rates and the impact that they're having on housing lock right now, because it's the absolute opposite incentive to stay. So, Mr. Rowland.
Thank you. So you talked about, there are mechanisms out there to fund public utilities. What are some of those ideas?
Yeah, I'm not, I'm definitely not an expert in all the ways that it could be done, but you can have, so the example I gave with ADA, in the North Pole housing for Eielson Air Force Base, that's it's a state-owned entity, has a big balance sheet. They can easily afford to build the kind of site infrastructure, and then through the disposing of the properties, through sale, they can recoup some of those costs in various ways. So you can have a public type of an authority that has the ability to do that. They have to have enough of a balance sheet. They have to have enough of an asset-based money to actually do that, to fund it up front, and then recoup that investment over a period of time through various means, whether it's through assessment on the property taxes or whatever it might be. There are certainly ways to do that, but you have to have enough upfront money to be able to do it, right? So I'm not an expert in all the kind of models that could be used for that, but this is not something where we have to invent it from whole cloth, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think one thing that I hope that Anchorage sort of reinitiates a conversation on eventually is doing a stormwater utility and potentially capturing funds that could be used not only for maintenance of our existing utilities, but also to put utilities where they currently don't exist. And we have areas, particularly even downtown, where we really need that kind of investment. And some of the members have discussed too, how can we make it easier to convert into housing, and often the utilities is a big hindrance to that. So I don't know if this administration is supportive, but I think the stormwater utility, in my continued war on excess surface parking, I think that would be very interesting. Thanks.
Ms. Alton.
Thanks. So Nolan, if you had a magic wand, what's the number one thing you would change in the short term?
Well, let's see. I've had this idea of, I think I'm always cautious about like understanding the limits of what I think we know with real certainty. But I do think though that a lot of regional economists that I've talked about this and that I've read about this generally look at zoning as something that is a net drag on overall social welfare. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should eliminate all zoning, but there are people who say that. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should eliminate all zoning. There are reasons to separate certain kinds of land uses, right? There certainly are. But I think that there's a lot of nationally, this conversation is really turning against zoning and looking at it as not having tremendously beneficial value in terms of the costs and benefits. And I think that that's something to think really hard about. Is the Title 21, like what in there needs to be there? You could think about the whole idea of zero-based budgeting, where you start from zero and you add in what's necessary. What if you had an approach like that, zero-based zoning? Add in what's necessary. I suspect that is an area that could move toward greater construction of housing. I'm saying that as something that I have a strong hunch about and not something that I can tell you definitively with data.
Great, thanks for entertaining the question. That'll be my repeat refrain. So if you are going to be a presenter, think about what your magic wand idea is, because I think that really kind of gets us down to brass tacks. Like if we could do it, what could we do? So thank you.
Thank you. I want to close this out. I'm going to ask a question of either Mr. Wilbur or Mr. Lyon. We had a conversation earlier with Nolan that was, how do we capture the reconfiguration of units, the changes of use, the commercial into residential, the formerly unoccupied or unoccupiable into occupied properties, into the tally of properties that are usable for residential, so we can have a more accurate analysis of what our housing stock is doing. Is that something we have a tool for?
I'd say we're certainly willing to entertain it. I mean, certainly work with you. I don't know how that would be done right now.
Okay, so I would definitely put that on the project dashboard, coming up with a way to capture the adaptive reuse, the other functions, the restorations and other projects, because we aren't capturing hundreds of units of conversions of hotel units into housing. And that means it tells a story that's not accurate. So that's a dashboard item. Thank you. So now we're going to go into the fun part, social mixer, 15-minute break. Copy over here, restrooms in the back. And I will do my very best to rein you all back at 11:45. Thank you.